What would you do if the person you loved most was attacked in broad daylight and the world tried to pretend it never happened? This is the story of a husband who refused to stay silent, a woman who turned pain into power, and a city that could never look away again. Stay with us, because once you hear what happened next, you'll never forget it. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It was supposed to be one of those afternoons people dream about, but rarely live. The kind that feels wrapped in gold, where every breath seems a little easier, every step a little lighter. Savannah, Georgia, wore its beauty like an old, familiar quilt. The Spanish moss swung low from ancient oak trees. The sidewalks baked warm under a generous sun. And somewhere, the scent of fresh bread and sea salt drifted lazily through the breeze. Amara Lewis clutched a small paper bag against her growing belly, each step measured and deliberate. Inside the bag were 6 bright oranges, the kind her husband Nathan loved, the kind that tasted of sunlight and memory. She had picked them up after her shift at the public library, thinking, hoping that tonight would be one of those simple, perfect evenings. A hot dinner, a quiet laugh, Nathan's hands rubbing her tired back. Maybe they would finally choose a name for the baby growing stronger inside her each day. Amara's world, in that moment, was small and full. Just her child, and the winding cobblestone path home. She never saw the cruiser until it was too late. It slipped around the corner of Bull and Liberty Streets like a shark through still water, silent, predatory. The engine rumbled low, almost thoughtfully, as if considering its options. Amara kept walking, one hand braced against her lower back, the other shielding her bag of oranges. She wasn't loitering. She wasn't causing trouble. She was simply existing. The car idled alongside her for a beat too long, then screeched to a stop with a sound that ripped across the quiet afternoon. Birds scattered from a nearby tree, their wings slicing through the sky in alarm. Amara turned, heart hammering against her ribs, just in time to see the door of the cruiser swing open with a force that made her flinch. Officer Brad Whitmore stepped out, his posture radiating a menace that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. His skin was the same bleached shade as his short-sleeved uniform, and his mouth was set in a hard, disdainful line. His hand hovered inches from his holster. "You there, stop," he barked, his voice sharp and immediate, like the crack of a whip. Amara froze. Instinctively, she placed both hands protectively over her stomach. She had been taught, by her mother, by the world, that stillness was survival. Speak calmly. Avoid eye contact. Don't make yourself a threat. "I'm just walking home," she said, her voice low and respectful, a practiced softness that didn't betray the fear curling in her gut. Whitmore's eyes flickered with something dangerous. "You look like you're up to something," he sneered. "Loitering, wandering. That's suspicious." The words barely made sense. Loitering? She was carrying groceries, feet swollen from standing all day, belly heavy with life. But it didn't matter. The facts never mattered in moments like this. "Sir, I'm just trying to get home," she repeated, careful, controlled. Don't talk back, he snapped, stepping closer. His shadow fell over her like a storm cloud. I said stop moving. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. She wasn't doing anything except praying. Praying that this would somehow, end differently than the stories whispered behind closed doors and shared in panicked text threads. Then, without warning, he shoved her. It was not a rough nudge. It was not a jostle. It was the kind of push meant to humiliate, to declare dominion. Amara's body jerked backward, her feet tangling over uneven pavement. The oranges spilled from her hands, rolling across the sidewalk like tiny suns. Her arms flew instinctively around her stomach, a mother's reflex encoded in her very bones. Pain ripped through her side as she landed hard on her hip. But it didn't stop there. Before Amara could scramble to her knees, before she could even process the shock rattling through her bones, Whitmore's boot connected with her abdomen in one brutal, senseless kick. The sound was small, a soft, ugly thud, but it echoed in her skull louder than a gunshot. Her scream split the air. People across the street turned. Some gasped. A woman dropped her shopping bag, tomatoes spilling like blood across the pavement. A man pulled out his phone, thumb trembling on the record button. No one moved. No one intervened. Because to interfere was to invite the same fury onto yourself. Amara crumpled on the ground, arms cocooning her belly, gasping for air that refused to come. Pain blossomed white-hot and merciless. She could not think. She could not move. She could only plead, silently, that the small life inside her had somehow survived the impact. Officer Whitmore stared down at her for a long, chilling moment. Then he turned his back, sauntered toward his cruiser, and drove away like nothing had happened. Like she wasn't a woman. Like she wasn't carrying a future. Like she wasn't even human. The sirens came minutes later, but they felt like hours. An ambulance screeched to a halt. EMTs raced to her side. One knelt in front of her, speaking in frantic, soothing tones. Amara tried to answer, but could only choke on her own panic. As they loaded her onto the stretcher, a name echoed through the fractured chambers of her mind. Nathan. Nathan would come. Nathan would find her. And when he did, Savannah would never be the same again. Because what Officer Whitmore didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that someone was watching. Someone who wasn't just angry. Someone who wasn't just sad. Someone who was ready to fight back in ways that would rip the silence from this city's history, exposing everything it had tried so desperately to bury. This wasn't just a sidewalk assault. This was a spark. And soon, Savannah would burn with a fire it could no longer ignore. Nathan Lewis never remembered how he got to the hospital. One moment, he was stacking case files at his counseling center, thinking about dinner with Amara. The next, he was blowing past red lights, knuckles white around the steering wheel, headlights and sirens blurring into a single, endless scream. When he burst into the emergency room of Memorial Health University Medical Center, the world narrowed to the single name trembling on his lips: Amara. He skidded to a stop at the nurse's station, words tangled in his throat. A nurse with kind eyes and blood on her scrubs pointed wordlessly down the hall. Room 208. Nathan nearly ripped the door from its hinges. The sight of her broke him clean in two. Amara lay curled on a gurney, hospital blankets swallowing her small frame. Her face was pale, her lips split, bruises blooming dark across her arms. But it was her hands that undid him, both wrapped protectively around her belly, as if she could still shield the child from the world that had already betrayed them. He dropped to his knees beside her, grasping her hand, whispering her name over and over like a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to. The doctor arrived moments later, clinical and hurried, tossing out phrases Nathan barely absorbed. Blunt force trauma, threat of placental abruption, elevated fetal stress. He understood only this: Amara was alive. The baby's heartbeat was steady, but the danger was not over. Nathan stayed with her through the night, his hand never leaving hers. Amara drifted in and out of restless sleep, flinching whenever a door slammed too hard or a voice rose too loud. Her body was here, but her mind was still lying on that sidewalk, under the boot of a man who had been sworn to protect. Morning came, dragging with it an unfamiliar heaviness. Nathan stepped outside for air, his heart pounding against the cage of his ribs. As he pushed through the hospital's revolving doors, he stopped cold. They were there. At first, it was only a handful of people. A woman in scrubs lighting a candle. A man with a homemade sign that read, "Justice for Amara." A college kid sitting cross-legged on the grass, head bowed in prayer. But as the minutes stretched into hours, they multiplied. 10 became 50. 50 became 100. Savannah was waking up. The video had exploded across social media overnight. Shot from across the street, grainy but damning, it showed everything. Whitmore's shove, Amara's desperate plea, the vicious kick, the way her body crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. There was no debate, no spinning it as miscommunication or standard procedure. It was brutality, naked and raw, and people had seen it. By midday, the hashtag Justice for Amara was trending nationally. Activists, artists, politicians, celebrities, all adding their voices to a chorus of outrage that grew louder by the minute. Nathan's phone vibrated nonstop. Calls from journalists, old army buddies, strangers offering prayers, lawyers offering help. But Nathan didn't want pity. He wanted change. Inside the hospital, Amara stirred awake. Her voice was raspy, her body trembling from the shock that had not yet fully receded. "Baby," she whispered, "they're watching now, aren't they?" Nathan brushed a curl from her forehead, his chest tightening. "Yeah," he said, "they're watching." Later that afternoon, standing beneath the heavy boughs of Savannah's oaks, Nathan faced a crowd that had doubled yet again. Students with backpacks and protest signs, grandmothers holding candles, veterans standing at attention, mothers pushing strollers, fathers with toddlers on their shoulders, every shade of skin, every walk of life. A local pastor handed Nathan a megaphone. He hesitated only a moment. "My name is Nathan Lewis," he began, voice low but clear. "And the woman lying in that hospital room, beaten, bruised, but still standing, is my wife." The crowd leaned closer, drawn by something raw and magnetic in his voice. "Yesterday, a man with a badge decided my wife didn't belong. He decided her life was disposable. He decided our child's future wasn't worth protecting." He paused, swallowing the rage that threatened to choke him. But he was wrong. Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. Because what he didn't count on was all of you. What he didn't count on was the cameras. What he didn't count on was the power of a community that refuses to stay silent. Nathan's voice rose, fueled by the fire burning through his veins. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are demanding basic human dignity. We are demanding accountability. We are demanding justice for Amara for our child, and for every person who's ever been told their life doesn't matter. Applause thundered through the square, fierce and defiant. By nightfall, the sidewalk in front of the hospital looked like a river of light. Candles flickered against the darkness. Flowers piled up along the curb. Handwritten notes in shaky script read, "We believe you. We see you. We fight for you." It wasn't a protest. It was an awakening. The mayor's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern and promising an internal investigation. The police department suspended Officer Whitmore with pay and urged the public not to rush to judgment. It wasn't enough. Nathan knew it. Amara knew it. Savannah knew it. The next morning, Nathan met with a civil rights attorney named Camille Hart, a firebrand known for dragging entire systems into the light, one lawsuit at a time. Over coffee in a cramped office, they mapped out a plan. Gather every witness, secure every video, control the narrative before it could be twisted into something unrecognizable. "We're not just fighting for Amara," Camille said, her voice fierce. "We're fighting for every woman who was too scared to file a report, every family who was told to move on, every life that got swept under the rug." Nathan nodded. "We're not asking anymore," he said. "We're taking our place." Outside, the city's heartbeat was changing. Savannah, once a place where injustice slithered in silence, was learning a new song. And it sounded a lot like revolution. It would have been easy for the anger to die down after the first wave of outrage. That was how it usually went. A spark, a flare of indignation, then life returned to normal, a little more jaded, a little more broken. But Nathan Lewis had no intention of letting this be another name added to a forgotten list. Within days of Amara's assault, the steps of City Hall became a second gathering place. What started as a vigil turned into a rally. What began as a demand turned into an organized call to action. Nathan wasn't just mourning anymore. He was planning. He and Camille Hart, along with a handful of trusted advocates, formed a coalition they called the Savannah Justice Collective. Their mission was simple in words, but monumental in scope: dismantle the system that had allowed Officer Brad Whitmore to remain in uniform despite a history of complaints that had been conveniently brushed aside. It didn't take long to uncover what had been hidden in plain sight. Through public records requests and whistleblowers within the police department, Camille and her team unearthed a series of misconduct reports against Whitmore. Use of excessive force, racial profiling, intimidation, all neatly buried beneath paperwork and procedural jargon. Complaints filed, complaints lost, investigations opened, then quietly closed. For Nathan, each page they uncovered felt like a personal betrayal. Amara wasn't Whitmore's first victim. She was just the one who had survived long enough, visibly enough, to pull the mask off an entire institution. At the next community meeting, Nathan stood before a packed crowd inside the historic First African Baptist Church, its walls echoing the weight of past struggles for freedom. He laid the documents out on a folding table, page after damning page, under a single, unflinching spotlight. "This isn't about one bad cop," Nathan said, his voice steady, resonating off the stained glass windows. "This is about a system that protected him. This is about every desk where a complaint was filed and forgotten, every superior who turned a blind eye, every silence that allowed him to walk the streets with a badge and a gun." People leaned forward in their pews, the air thick with a righteous anger that demanded to be channeled. That night, the Savannah Justice Collective launched two major initiatives. The first was a civil lawsuit against Officer Whitmore in the city, seeking not just damages for Amara, but mandatory reforms in police oversight policies. The second was the establishment of Safe Steps, a nonprofit aimed at providing legal aid, advocacy training, and mental health support for Black mothers facing systemic violence. But they didn't stop at legal filings and paperwork. Nathan understood that real change needed more than courtrooms. It needed hearts and minds. It needed stories that refused to be ignored. So they took to the streets. They organized workshops at Savannah State University, teaching students how to document police encounters safely. They held town halls in neighborhood centers, creating spaces for residents to share their own experiences, stories that had been gathering dust in the corners of memory, too painful to speak aloud until now. They partnered with local artists to paint murals of Amara, not as a victim, but as a symbol of survival, resilience, and hope. The city that once flinched at the mention of injustice was now covered in its reminder. Nathan found himself speaking at churches, on radio shows, in living rooms and barbershops. He learned quickly that movements weren't built with speeches alone. They were built with late nights stuffing envelopes, with tense phone calls persuading reluctant leaders to sign on, with early mornings setting up folding chairs under bruised skies. It was exhausting. It was relentless. It was necessary. And all the while, he returned each evening to Memorial Health University Medical Center, where Amara's strength astounded him more than any rally or headline. She never asked him to stop, even when her hands trembled from the medication, even when fear crept into her voice late at night. Instead, she said, "If we don't stand now, we'll spend the rest of our lives kneeling." Amara, too, became a quiet architect of the movement. She wrote letters from her hospital bed, open letters to the mayor, the police chief, the citizens of Savannah. Her words, raw and unvarnished, spread online like wildfire. She refused to let her pain be sanitized for public consumption. She named it. She owned it. And in doing so, she gave permission for others to do the same. Soon, other cities were calling. Activists in Atlanta, Charleston, and New Orleans wanted to replicate the Safe Steps model. Journalists embedded themselves within the Savannah Justice Collective, chronicling the growth of a movement that refused to fade quietly. Even national figures began to notice. When a well-known senator visited Savannah to meet Nathan and Amara, the cameras swarmed. But Nathan kept the focus exactly where it belonged, on the people, on the mothers who had marched every night after work, on the students who had risked their scholarships to protest, on the veterans who had shown up in uniform, medals glinting in the sun, to remind the city that service and justice were supposed to mean something. Change was no longer a distant hope. It was tangible, inevitable, heavy in the humid Georgia air. The police union fought back, of course. They launched a PR campaign painting Whitmore as a misunderstood officer caught in a complex situation. Anonymous threats trickled in, growing more venomous as the movement gained traction. But Nathan had been under fire before, in a different kind of battlefield, and he knew the only way through was forward. One night, after a town hall that ran late into the evening, Nathan stood on the church steps, looking out over the flickering candles held by hundreds of people. He thought about the sidewalk where Amara had fallen, the crack of her body against the pavement, the scream that had torn through the air. That scream had not been in vain. It had woken a city. It had built a movement, and it was only just beginning. The courtroom smelled like old paper and nerves. Sunlight slanted through high windows, striping the walls with pale, dusty gold. But inside, the air was cold, heavy. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Some came dressed in Sunday best, others in worn jeans and printed t-shirts bearing Amara's face beneath the words, "Justice for Amara." Reporters crowded into every available corner, their cameras waiting to catch the tremble of a voice, the crack of a verdict. Nathan Lewis sat beside Camille Hart at the plaintiff's table, shoulders squared, but muscles tight enough to snap. Just a few feet away, across the polished wood floor, Officer Brad Whitmore hunched in a suit too tight across his thick shoulders. Without the uniform, he looked smaller somehow, less invincible. But Nathan didn't mistake smaller for weaker. A wounded giant was still dangerous. Amara sat in the front row of the gallery, her hands resting protectively over her abdomen. Her pregnancy had progressed farther than doctors once dared hope. She was a portrait of both fragility and fire, a woman who had walked through hell and emerged standing. The bailiff called the court to order, and the trial began. Camille's opening argument was a masterclass in precision and fury held carefully in check. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She walked the jury through the facts with a scalpel's edge. The video evidence, the eyewitnesses, the history of buried complaints against Whitmore. She told them the story of a sidewalk, a paper bag of oranges, a mother who never made it home. She told them about a kick that almost ended 2 lives before they began. When the defense attorney stood to rebut, his tone was practiced, oily. He painted Whitmore as a dedicated officer under unimaginable pressure. He suggested that Amara's behavior had been suspicious, that perhaps she had failed to comply quickly enough, that perhaps, what had happened was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Nathan watched the jurors closely. Some stiffened at the insinuation. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one looked convinced. The prosecution called their first witnesses. A young woman who had been sitting in the cafe across the street testified first. She described the scene with shaking hands, the police cruiser pulling up, the sudden violence, the sickening sound of impact. Next came an elderly man who had been walking his dog nearby. He spoke softly but firmly about what he saw, his voice cracking only when he said, "She never even raised her voice. She was just trying to get home." Each testimony chipped away at the facade Whitmore's defense tried desperately to maintain. Then came the video. They played it once, without commentary, on a large screen facing the jury. The room fell into a deeper silence as the grainy footage unspooled. Amara's careful steps, Whitmore's abrupt shove, the vicious kick, the way her body crumpled to the ground. There was no sound on the video, but in the room, people flinched as if they could still hear her scream. When Amara took the stand, Nathan's breath caught in his throat. She moved slowly, not from weakness, but from resolve. Every step, a deliberate defiance of the man who had tried to break her. Under oath, she told her story, not as a victim pleading for pity, but as a woman demanding acknowledgement. "I wasn't loitering," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I wasn't causing trouble. I was just trying to get home. I told him I was pregnant. I begged him not to hurt me." She paused, her eyes finding Nathan's for the briefest anchoring moment. But he didn't see a mother. He didn't see a person. He saw something he could hurt and walk away from. The courtroom sat breathless as Amara described the pain, the terror, the moments of icy stillness in the ambulance when she wondered if her baby was still alive. The defense tried to rattle her on cross-examination, suggesting inconsistencies, implying she had overreacted. But Amara never faltered. Every answer was clear, grounded not in anger, but in a kind of fierce, exhausted truth no amount of legal maneuvering could shake. When she stepped down, Nathan stood too, his hands clenching the arms of his chair to keep from rushing to her side. But Amara didn't need rescuing. Not anymore. As closing arguments began, Camille turned back to the jury one last time. "This is not complicated," she said. "You do not need years of legal training to see what happened here. You do not need a law degree to know right from wrong. You only need your eyes, your heart, your conscience." She paced slowly before the jury box. "Ask yourselves, if this were your wife, your daughter, your unborn child, would you still call it protocol? Would you still excuse it as a misunderstanding? Or would you demand justice?" The courtroom held its breath as the jury filed out to deliberate. Hours passed. Nathan sat frozen, barely breathing. Amara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining in a silent prayer. When the jury returned, Nathan felt the air in the room tighten like a drum, stretched too thin. The forewoman stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Bradley Whitmore, guilty on all counts." For a second, the world seemed to tilt. Then sound returned in a wave. Gasps, muffled sobs, the heavy exhale of a community that had dared to hope and finally found their faith rewarded. Nathan didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply turned to Amara, who was already looking at him, her eyes brimming but steady. They had done it. They had faced the giant, and they had won. But Nathan knew, as he rose to his feet and helped Amara stand, that this victory was not the end of the road. It was only the beginning. Hope Lewis entered the world on a clear, trembling morning in early spring. As Nathan held his daughter for the first time, he understood, in a way he never had before, why he and Amara had fought so hard, why they had stood up against a force that had tried to crush them into silence. She was small, warm, impossibly fierce already, her tiny hand curling instinctively around Nathan's thumb. In her presence, the world seemed to sharpen, to matter more. Amara smiled through tears, exhaustion etched deep in her face, but pride burning brighter. They had named her Hope, not because they were naive, but because they had survived the storm and could now see the sky clearing. Hope was not the absence of struggle. It was the commitment to fight, to build, to believe anyway. In the months that followed the trial, Nathan and Amara refused to let their victory turn into complacency. They founded the Hope Rises Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal assistance to victims of police misconduct, creating educational programs for marginalized communities, and advocating for systemic reforms that extended beyond Savannah. It wasn't just about reacting to injustice anymore. It was about preventing it before it could ever take root. They launched the Safe Streets Initiative, lobbying the city council and state representatives to implement independent oversight boards and body camera mandates. When the bill passed, it was met with cheers and tears from a crowd gathered under the same oak trees where Amara's scream had once torn through the air. Change, Nathan realized, often moved slower than pain demanded. But it moved. The foundation also opened a summer camp, where young people learn not just their rights, but their worth. They studied civic leadership, grassroots organizing, the art of storytelling. They learned that their voices were not liabilities, but weapons, sharp and necessary in a world too comfortable with silence. At community meetings, Amara spoke softly but powerfully about resilience, about the dignity of survival, about how justice wasn't something handed down from lofty places, but something fought for, piece by piece, in ordinary lives. Watching her speak, Nathan often marveled at the journey they had walked, at how the woman who once trembled under fluorescent hospital lights now stood before crowds, holding her daughter against her heart, planting seeds with every word. Sometimes, late at night, Nathan would walk Hope through their neighborhood, pointing out the places where change had bloomed like stubborn flowers through concrete. Here, a mural of Amara lit up an alleyway. There, a community center thrived where an abandoned building once stood. Everywhere, reminders that what they had built was bigger than themselves. The fight wasn't over. Nathan knew it never truly would be. But as he looked down at his daughter's wide, fearless eyes, he felt something new, something sacred, certainty. The seeds they had planted would grow. And this time, no one would dare to tear them out. Nathan and Amara Lewis never intended to spark a movement. They never set out to confront an entire system or carry the weight of a city's conscience on their shoulders. All they wanted, in the beginning, was to build a quiet life together, to raise a child in a world that felt a little safer than the one they had inherited. But fate had other plans. One violent act on an ordinary sidewalk shattered their peace, but it did not shatter them. It woke them. It forced them to stand where others had been crushed, to speak where others had been silenced, to build where others had been erased. Their fight was never just about one officer or one verdict. It was about pulling back the curtain on the quiet, suffocating injustices that too many people had been taught to accept. It was about demanding a world where walking home while black didn't carry a price. It was about a child named Hope, born from pain, but wrapped in a future that looked a little freer because her parents refused to bow their heads. Nathan and Amara's story teaches us that true change is never comfortable. It doesn't come gift-wrapped in apologies or ushered in by those who benefit from the way things are. True change is messy. It demands sacrifice. It calls for sleepless nights, for standing when your knees tremble, for believing in a better world even when the evidence is scarce. It means planting seeds you may never live to see bloom, knowing that someone else's child will sit in the shade of the trees you fought to grow. The lesson we take from their journey is clear. Injustice thrives when good people stay quiet. Courage isn't found in grand gestures. It lives in the small, daily choices to refuse to accept what is broken. You don't have to be a lawyer, a politician, or a celebrity to make a difference. You just have to show up. You have to believe that your voice matters, your presence matters, your refusal to look away matters. Apply it to your life today. Speak up at your school, your workplace, your community meetings. Advocate for those who aren't heard. Vote not just for yourself, but for the future. Teach your children that dignity is non-negotiable, that kindness is powerful, and that silence, when faced with wrong, is its own form of betrayal. Because the world does not change simply because we want it to. It changes because we insist that it must. If the story of Nathan, Amara, and Hope moved you today, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support fuels the creation of powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and ignite the courage in all of us. Click the subscribe button, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who still believes that one voice, one family, one choice can change everything. Together, let's build a future where no one is left fighting alone. Thank you for being part of this journey.